I've talked extensively about Yu Yu Hakusho over the lifetime of this channel, and while I still have to cover the Spirit Detective arc so that we have a complete analysis of the entire anime, I wanted to pivot a bit into what's mostly unknown territory for me, the manga. As big of a fan of the franchise as I am, I have surprisingly little interaction with the primary source material aside from reading a few chapters here and there when I was subscribed to Shonen Jump as a kid. So I thought it would be fun to not only read the manga, but compare it to the anime I've come to love and see just how closely the versions stick together or how far the anime diverges. This is going to be a multi-part series on its own because I have to take twice as many notes as I usually do, not to mention having to find and archive volumes of the manga is a tedious task. With that in mind, this first video is going to encompass the first half of the Spirit Detective arc, from Yusuke's death up to his victory over Rando. That covers episodes 1 through 13 of the anime, and up through about halfway through volume 4 of the manga. This isn't going to be a comprehensive breakdown of the story, and I'm not going to list every single minor change, but I will be pointing out things that are missing, when things diverge entirely, have their orders shuffled, things that are added or extended, and just other interesting changes. This is less about putting an analytical microscope to the material, and more about enjoying the discovery of the contrast between iterations. This is going to be closer to a list rather than the standard unpacking I usually do. Before we get into that though, a huge shout out to these wonderful people for their continued support over on Patreon, with a special shout out to Celestial Tier backers Angus Clydesdale, Super Sunset, This One Sneck, Totally Reasonable Curb, and Trey Hardy. If you'd like to see videos early, see your name in, or select a portrait for the credit scroll, consider heading to the link in the description and pinned comment to show some support. Liking the video, commenting, and subscribing definitely also helps small channels like mine though, so I'd appreciate it if you could do that while you're here too. Let me know what other anime you'd like to see me compare to its source material because I plan to do more than just Yu Yu Hakusho. I also apologize in advance if you get tired of hearing me say in the manga. There's not really a way for me to get around that. Alright, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive right into volume 1 of the series. Right out the gate, Yusuke is smoking on the roof, unlike in the anime where he's tossing candies in the air. Keiko doesn't mention the color of Yusuke's uniform because in this medium, it's not obviously clear if he's wearing a different color. Instead, she mentions that he's wearing street shoes. In both versions, Yusuke lifts Keiko's skirt, but in the anime he mentions they're lacy, while in the manga he says they're ugly and crack-stained. When Yusuke comes across the student that name-dropped him and got a guy's wallet in the anime, Yusuke gets irritated when the guy offers him the money. In the manga, when Yusuke corners the guy, he demands a 500 yen fee for name-dropping. Apparently Yusuke is a whole-ass ninja in the manga that can use substitution jutsu to get away from Takanaka versus just using a fake ear. Naturally, there's a difference between how Atsuko is dressed in the manga versus the show, which makes sense. Botan's list of Yusuke's antics is longer in the manga and includes things like shoplifting, smoking, drinking, gambling, etc. All things you wouldn't want children hearing on television. In the manga, Masaru's mother actually asks about Yusuke's condition and is then saddened to hear he died saving her son. In the anime, the doctor says Masaru is alright and the show moves right back to Yusuke and Botan. The portrait for Yusuke at his wake is even better than the anime glamour shot. Kuwabara's segment at the wake is half the length of its anime counterpart. He never makes it into the building and he never says his "you're supposed to be there for me" line. The moment with Masaru plays out slightly differently with the dialogue and it still gets the overall point across, it's just not as punchy as it ends up becoming in the anime. Small difference, but in the manga, Koenma's desk is in the same room as the ogres running around handling operations. In the anime, it's in a private office attached to that operations room. Koenma is also wearing a bib here, which is hilarious to me. In the manga, we get some extra moments with Keiko that really lean into her quiet sadness over losing Yusuke. We get some time with Atsuko in the manga as well, who's looking back on a time Yusuke got a fever after falling into some cold water and how Keiko wouldn't leave his side. In the anime, Koenma is very upfront about the ordeal Yusuke's facing as well as the potential consequences. In the manga, he specifically holds back the information that the energy Yusuke feeds into the egg determines what kind of creature comes out of it. He only expresses this to Botan. In the manga, Yusuke is the one that recalls his body is set to be cremated. In the anime, it's Botan that brings this up. This just barely counts as a difference, but I'm going to include it because it's funny. When Botan expresses that Yusuke can enter someone's dream to talk to them, the manga uses this great illustration of Togashi in bed. In the manga, when Yusuke visits Keiko in her sleep, the fact Yusuke wiped her tears away is what convinces her there was merit to the dream. In the anime, she's sure that she felt him touch her cheek. The manga's very next scene is of Keiko and Atsuko together, where Atsuko conveys that Yusuke is alive, confirming Keiko's dream. The anime, however, uses the entire second half of its episode to get to the same moment. In the anime, Yusuke has to possess Kuwabara to find Keiko and convince her a second time that he's coming back and to protect his body. The manga handles this section with Kuwabara a little differently. Yusuke possesses his body so that he can say some last words to Keiko before his trial officially begins. According to Botan, while he's undergoing his ordeal, he's prohibited from talking to anyone he knows and cares cares about. The trials Yusuke goes through for a good chunk of his test is exclusive to the manga. Some things do make it in, but we'll touch on those once we reach them. The first manga exclusive story follows a boy named Shota, which is kind of an unfortunate name, whose dog Jiro is dying of old age. The kid is deeply attached to the dog and is taking his looming death pretty hard. The dog, according to Botan, is only even alive out of sheer force of will through loyalty to the boy, knowing the kid has it pretty rough. Even after the dog dies, its spirit just circles above the house, refusing to leave out of concern for Shota. Yusuke hatches a plan to somewhat trick the boy into being less emotionally dependent on the dog and standing on his own 2 feet. It works like a charm, and Shota is able to move beyond his grief and honor a promise he made by standing up to his bullies. It's pretty nice. The next story brings Yusuke and Botan into contact with a ghost on Christmas Day that can't find peace after death. Turns out the ghost had arranged to meet up with a guy named Kenji at that bench to spend Christmas together the previous year. Unfortunately, on the day of, she fell ill, went into a coma, and ultimately died. So she waits there, hoping he'll show so that she can apologize. Yusuke and Botan sit with her to see if Kenji might show up in the crowd randomly. He does show up to the same bench, but to see a different girl, where he mentions that the previous year, he knew a girl that would wait hours for him, and that he'd bet a friend 10,000 yen that she'd wait for him right there for 5 hours. After seeing how upset the girl is, Yusuke takes her for a night on the town to help ease her pain and help her move on to the afterlife. It's incredibly sweet, and then Yusuke takes his own jabs at Kenji on behalf of the girl. After this, Yusuke and Botan come across a grumbly old man who's coming up on the end of his life. After the loss of his immediate family in a vehicle accident, he lives alone and drives off anyone who tries to get close or be kind to him. That's when they meet a tanuki who was once saved by the old man and his grandson. The tanuki is there to pay his respects and uses its transformation powers to take on the form of the grandson the old man had lost. We see the old man is just lonely in the absence of his deceased family. The tanuki can only keep its transformation active at night, and for 5 nights it visits the old man. On the 5th night, where the old man is scheduled to pass on, he convinces the tanuki to stay with him through the night. In the morning, the tanuki turns back to normal, and it turns out the old man knew all along. Being near death, he was able to see the tanuki's tail, which under normal circumstances, he wouldn't be able to. They share a touching moment before the old man passes, and man, I've really been enjoying these extra stories. The following chapter finally converges with the anime again, following Kuwabara around for a week. In the anime, a fight starts when Kuwabara's crew swoops in to save Keiko from being harassed by students from another school. In the manga, the story starts with them being lectured by Mr. Akashi in the teacher's lounge, who alludes to the fight. The general premise for this section is that right after the fight, Akashi intends to have Akubo removed from his part-time job as punishment. Knowing Akubo needs that job to help look after his family, Kuwabara agrees to go 1 week without fighting. For the most part, the story plays out almost identically between the 2 iterations, with a few exceptions. In the manga, when Yusuke goes to fend off some punks closing in on Kuwabara, he does so before helping him study, and does so by putting out strong enough vibes to give them the creeps. In the anime, this same sequence plays out after he helps Kuwabara study for the big science test, and he possesses a girl's body to defend Kuwabara. The dream sequence is also extended a bit in the anime. Continuing with the anime, when Akashi realizes Kuwabara scored higher than the needed 50%, it's Iwamoto who directs him to erase Kuwabara's last answer. In the manga, he does it of his own accord without Iwamoto being present. In the anime, after the confrontation between Kuwabara and Akashi, Kuwabara walks off in defeat, and Takanaka walks up afterward. In the manga, it's Takanaka who breaks up the scuffle and calms Kuwabara down. The next segment is a manga-only bit once again. Yusuke has to rejoin with his body for a day, since the body and soul can't be separated for too long without ramifications. After running into some bullies, Keiko stands up for her friends as well as Kuwabara's crew when they intervene to help. Keiko's actions essentially get her kidnapped by the leader of the group, which puts Yusuke in a tricky spot since he's still not allowed to talk to any of his loved ones until after he returns to life. And he isn't exactly supposed to be roaming the town right now. Using a disguise he got from the arcade he was at earlier in the day, Yusuke heads to where Keiko's being kept. Seeing the goons had knocked her out cold puts Yusuke in the offense, and he wraps things up fast. Keiko briefly wakes up but doesn't seem to register it's Yusuke she's looking at before passing back out. Kuwabara shows up after it's all over, and after Yusuke explains the situation, he's asked to let Keiko believe she was saved by him, not Yusuke. But Keiko was only pretending to be knocked out and she heard the entire conversation. But because Yusuke didn't actually speak to her directly, he's technically off the hook. Once that's over, Yusuke and Botan return to see how Shota's doing. He seems fine, but there's a black mass attached to him. Turns out he's befriended a ghost that's pulling his soul out of his body night after night to play with her. But as someone without spirit awareness, this forced separation between the body and the soul is slowly damaging Shota's body. Should this continue, his body will fail, but Shota doesn't know what's happening to him, and Botan states he likely doesn't remember his nightly playdates with Sayaka. This marks the appearance of Sayaka as the problematic ghost in question. In the anime, Sayaka appears as an investigator to evaluate the relationship between Yusuke and the people closest to him to determine if they even want him to return to life. This Sayaka is a lonely little girl who died from an unnamed sickness in a household where her parents often left her with the housekeeper since they didn't know how to cope with the fact their daughter was dying. After her death, she remained by her bedroom window, longing for the connections she saw other children had, which led to Shota noticing her. Yusuke and Botan manage to rescue Shota before Sayaka can attempt to forcefully drag him to heaven, which would have ultimately resulted in both of them being ejected into purgatory thanks to the resentment lingering in Sayaka's heart. But afterward, Yusuke offers to play with her the way Shota had, so that when she was ready to truly go to heaven, she'd have some good memories to take with her. The next story involves a pair of best friends named Eri and Katsumi who are competing against each other to get into a prestigious school. Unbeknownst to Eri, Katsumi put a curse on Eri due to the pressure from internal and external forces. After realizing Eri just wants the best for her, Katsumi tears up the curse only for it to burn itself into her arm as a different apparition makes it clear they intend to continue targeting Eri. Their friendship prevails and the two ultimately decide not to compete with each other and instead attend a different school together. After these stories, we once again somewhat converge with the anime, but only somewhat. In the anime, this is where Sayaka appears to judge if people truly want Yusuke back. In the manga, she's focused solely on Keiko after she develops a bit of a crush on Yusuke. She wants to determine if Keiko is qualified to be Yusuke's girlfriend in her eyes, which leads to following her around in the same fashion as the anime. When the fire starts, in the manga, Yusuke tries to possess himself, but can't since he'd just done it the other day for maintenance, but in the anime, Botan tells him he can't revive until the egg hatches since this element of the plot was cut out. Yusuke tries to get his neighbors to notice the fire in the manga before Botan suggests Kuwabara. In the anime, Kuwabara is suggested right away. In the manga, Koenma shows up and saves Keiko himself at the cost of Yusuke's virtue, which is the goodwill and energy he'd been storing up over the course of his ghost adventures. This doesn't completely remove his ability to return to life though, it just sets him back to square one, delaying his revival. In the anime, the only way to save Keiko is to throw his egg into the fire, releasing its energy. This clears a path for Keiko but also sacrifices his only ticket to return to life. However, Koenma decides to revive him soon anyway. Also in the manga, Kuwabara doesn't show up until after Keiko has rescued Yusuke. Toward the end of the chapter we meet Shizuru, who points out that Yusuke is nearby keeping an eye on Keiko. During the next manga exclusive chapter, Yusuke possesses a kid known as Matsu the Dud and proceeds to help him along his journey to achieve one victory in boxing and build the courage to finally face his doubts. This is also where Koenma reveals he's decided to let Yusuke back into his own body if he can help Matsuo solve his current problems or achieve his goals. The manga and anime line up again when Yusuke needs someone to kiss him to get his soul back into his body. These versions line up pretty closely, albeit with some additional or removed dialogue. Yusuke is wearing a different outfit in the manga when he returns to life than the one in the anime. This entire section with Kuwabara getting his cat back and Yusuke being officially given the job as spirit detective go about the same, except in the anime, Koenma appears in the sky to give him the job. In the manga, Botan is the only one he speaks to here. The lead up to the demon trio stealing the artifacts is mostly the same, though in the anime the episodes begin by showing us the heist. In the manga, the section of the story begins with Yusuke's mom waking him up and the transition back into school life. The anime also takes a few moments to set up the dragon pen that goes missing, whereas the manga only brings it up when Iwamoto attempts to frame Yusuke. In the anime, when Koenma appears to put Yusuke on the case, he freezes time. In the manga, he doesn't, so Iwamoto's just awkwardly standing there. Another difference is that in the manga, Iwamoto intends to incinerate the stolen goods but plans to keep the dragon pen for himself, so only it is in his pocket when Yusuke confronts him. In the anime, all of the stolen goods are just stuffed into his pocket. In the manga, after learning the spirit gun, Yusuke immediately sets out to find the artifacts. In the anime, Koenma takes the time to show Yusuke what he's after as well as explain why they're so dangerous. The manga continues to cut right to the chase, and while investigating in Uptown, Yusuke spots the trio walking together, singling them out thanks to Goki's horns. In the anime, he goes uptown, a kid collapses, and he follows its soul back to the alley where he then spots just Goki by himself, and horns give him away. There's a very brief confrontation with some thugs before he sets off in pursuit of Goki. It isn't until we see the trio together in the forest that we get the briefest descriptions of what each item can do in the manga. The Mirror of Darkness gets vague descriptions in both versions though. In the manga, Yusuke doesn't explain how he found them, but in the anime he points out that the spot they're standing in is the only area where the sun is shining during a rainstorm that's also not present in the manga. When Hiei leaves in the manga, it's out of a sense of caution since he figures Yusuke specifically was chosen to capture them for a reason. He's also the first to dip out. In the anime, he just kinda leaves, doing so only after Kurama has made his exit. The confrontation with Goki plays out about the same across both versions of the story. During the second confrontation in the manga, it isn't Botan that interrupts Goki, it's a random kid just stumbling upon the scene. Botan doesn't show up here at all. In the anime, she throws some wood at Goki to draw aggro away from Yusuke, which leads to the trick he uses to defeat the demon. Since Botan wasn't present in the manga for the Goki fight, naturally she's also not present when Yusuke has his first interaction with Kurama. In the manga, Kurama goes to Yusuke's school on the day of the full moon to lead him to the hospital his mother is in. In the anime, Kurama set up a meeting with Yusuke and just has Yusuke link up with him outside the hospital. Back to the manga, when Kurama is explaining his attachment to his mother, we get to see exactly what the incident was that changed his plan to leave, with that being his mother getting badly injured to protect him. The added sickness on top of that cemented that he was a son who loved his mother. In the anime, the simple explanation is that Kurama's mom fell ill and he couldn't bring himself to leave. In the manga, Kurama is more prepared to leave his mother behind after using the mirror because she's been seeing someone, so she won't be all alone without him. This isn't brought up at all in the anime. When it comes time to use the mirror in the manga, Yusuke offers some of his life so that the mirror doesn't take all of Kurama's. In the anime, Yusuke just straight up offers his life in place of Kurama's. When Botan meets Keiko, she's just being a bit weird but makes general conversation in the manga. In the anime, she references spirit detective related things that Keiko doesn't know about since Yusuke hasn't had a chance to bring her up to speed. When Hiei meets Keiko on the street, he doesn't say anything to her, he just does what he needs to do. In the anime, he takes the time to say something to her first. Following that, in the manga, Yusuke leaves in the middle of class and Botan meets him at the school gate. Yusuke's watch registers Hiei as being 5 kilometers away, which shouldn't be possible for Yusuke to detect at his current level of power. In the anime, Yusuke leaves what looks like an empty classroom around sunset and Botan joins him along the way. Yusuke mentions that the signal seems to be constantly 1 mile away, with Botan concluding Hiei is purposely leading them to his lair. Once they reach their destination, both versions have a group of mind-controlled humans in the building, but in the manga, they attack Yusuke only to be laid out immediately. In the manga, Hiei has a line about having planned to do away with Goki and Kurama himself to take their artifacts. Things proceed in relatively the same way, but diverge just slightly towards the end of the fight. In the manga, we're not shown that Yusuke spotted the Mirror of Darkness. After he fires the spirit gun, then he shuffles into place. In the anime, it's made clear that the mirror is what he's aiming for, and when he fires, he's already in the position he needs to be for it to collide with Hiei. Botan is the one that administers the antidote that prevents Keiko from turning into a demon in the manga. In the anime, it's Yusuke that performs this. Another difference is that in the manga, Botan tells Yusuke early in the day that Kurama is eligible for parole, and at the battle's conclusion, Kurama mentions his trial is pending. In the anime, Botan tells Yusuke that Kurama has been released on good behavior after reviewing his case. On his way to Genkai's compound, we see Yusuke isn't wearing his green jacket in the manga. In the anime, the flashback to Botan explaining the situation happens before Yusuke makes it up to the compound. In the manga, it happens after he sees how large the crowd is. Kuwabara is also wearing an alternate outfit during the section of the story in the manga. In the manga, Kuwabara makes it clear that Shizuru is the one that pointed him in Genkai's direction to help with his growing spirit awareness. In the anime, he shows up for the same reason but makes no mention of his sister's involvement. Kuwabara also demonstrates an actual understanding of spirit energy in the manga when he explains it to Yusuke. In the anime, this explanation doesn't happen. Things proceed along the same lines with the drawing of lots, 2 spiritualists being pissed they didn't make the cut, and rolling into the second test in the arcade. Once we get to the Cursed Forest, things diverge a little bit again. In the manga, we get a few panels with Kuwabara following his instincts, but the anime ignores his trek completely. It then goes right to Yusuke stumbling into Baldock the Bat Tamer's territory before cutting right to the final 7 making it to the tree, where he shows up just a few moments later dragging the Bat Tamer with him. The anime shows how Kibano and Kazamaru handle some of the journey through the forest while also showing some no-names getting overwhelmed. The anime also spends more time on Yusuke's confrontation with the Bat Tamer, who got a design overhaul, before he reconvenes with the rest of the finalists. Unlike the manga, he leaves Baldock strung up in one of the trees in his territory. Once we get to the one-on-one battles, the first difference is that the character Rando is masquerading as is named Shaolin in the manga, but Shurin in the anime. Also, the manga version of Kibano looks like Billy Mitchell, so he's probably lying about being an expert in anything. The Kazamaru vs Kuroda fight mostly goes unseen in the manga aside from the attack Kazamaru uses to finish the fight. The anime gives the pair a bit more of a back and forth. After this, in the manga, Botan just appears next to Yusuke out of nowhere to explain how Kazamaru's attack was similar to Yusuke's spirit gun, but better. This is also how Genkai realizes Koenma's backing Yusuke. In the anime, Yusuke links up with Botan outside to have a similar conversation. There's also the additional moment of Kuwabara being somewhat brought up to speed on who Botan is, what Yusuke's doing there in the first place, etc. Genkai establishes Yusuke's tie to Koenma when the trio come back inside. While short in both versions, the anime at least gives a few moments to Shuren's battle. In the manga, he just gets a single panel announcing his victory. It happened so suddenly that I had to go back a page to make sure I didn't miss the start of his battle. Kuwabara and Musashi's fight also goes pretty much the same beat for beat. The only real difference is that in the manga, Musashi is aware of what Kuwabara's spirit sword is when it comes out, but in the anime, he seems to have no idea what he's looking at. At the beginning of Yusuke's fight with Kibano, in the manga, Yusuke pulls his own pack of cigarettes out. In the anime, Genkai is the one smoking and throws her cigarette at Yusuke after he stalls the match to make a quip. The fight is pretty much exactly the same, with some extended fighting and dialogue, but the main difference is that the cigarette he uses to spot Kibano in the dark is his own and not Genkai's. As has been the case so far, the battle between Yusuke and Kazemaru plays out nearly identically. In the manga, it starts right away, but in the anime there's a bit with Koenma refusing to take a phone call that turns out to be his dad before the match starts. In the manga, Kazemaru notes that he could likely beat Yusuke without the use of his own spirit attack since the boy's so tired. In the anime, Yusuke kind of jokingly suggests they agree to not use them since they're so different in strength, with Kazemaru saying he'd prefer to handle him with his bare hands. After Kazemaru launches his shuriken, in the manga Yusuke notices on his own that they're homing in on him. In the anime, Botan and Kuwabara are the ones that point out they're headed back towards Yusuke. The rest of the match plays out beat for beat in the anime as it does in the manga, just takes a little longer to get there. The anime has some additional exposition from Koenma before the next battle begins to pad out the runtime a bit too. In the manga, before Yusuke goes to warn Kuwabara at the start of the match, Botan reminds him not to reveal classified information. Up to now, Yusuke hasn't been nearly as open about his reason for being at Genkai's compound as his anime counterpart. The battle between Kuwabara and Shuren plays out nearly 1-to-1 between both versions, with a minor difference in the anime being that Shuren tries to step on Kuwabara after shrinking him. In the manga, he immediately picks him up. After Kuwabara's defeat, the manga moves right to the next match with only a brief moment of Yusuke and Botan tending to Kuwabara. In the anime, Kuwabara says a few words which act to considerably fuel Yusuke's anger towards Shuren. Yusuke also reveals himself to be a spirit detective. During the Shuren portion of the battle, the manga explains the wind technique as buzzsaws of air whipped up by supersonic vortices coming from all sides. The anime describes the technique as a vacuum around the target that causes air to violently and painfully escape through cuts in the skin. In the manga, Yusuke just dives right in to avoid the worst of the effects. In the anime, he gets knocked down by one of the attacks and then dives in headfirst. Once the fight with Rando proper begins, in the manga, Yusuke goes right in with a flurry of punches. In the anime, Yusuke falls to one knee in exhaustion before things kick off, and Rando kind of rambles about how the toughest part of battle for him is choosing which technique to use. That's when Yusuke throws his flurry of punches. Once Rando breaks out the life force thread to ensnare Yusuke, in the manga, he begins to swing Yusuke around as a demonstration of the thread's strength. In the anime, he does so after saying that he could use it to crush Yusuke, and Yusuke calls out how boring that would be. So to add some quote-unquote excitement, he starts to swing the spirit detective around. The scene goes on for a while in the anime with Rando sending Yusuke crashing through trees and such. In the manga, this is 2 pages worth of action. The manga goes right from that to Yusuke being suspended from a tree, but in the anime, there's a small debate between Genkai and Botan about potentially passing her techniques to Rando in the event he wins. After this back and forth, the two versions step right back in sync. After Yusuke is dropped into the water to be eaten by Rando's fish, in the manga, when he pops up behind Rando, he's standing right behind him and gets a clean hit on the demon's face, which knocks him into the water. In the anime, Yusuke springs up into the air behind Rando, and the two have a spirit gun beam struggle, of which Yusuke wins, using that to knock Rando into the water. When Rando resurfaces in the manga, he just kinda casually climbs out of the water. In the anime, he flexes his demon energy to forcefully vacate the water from the small pond, which is much cooler. It only takes one punch in the manga to drop Yusuke after this, but in the anime he gets quite literally folded by a vicious assault. The rest of this portion of the story proceeds about the same across both versions, with the only difference I personally care about being when Yusuke falls on Rando with an elbow drop. In the manga, he brings it down on Rando's face, which really amuses me, but in the anime, he catches Rando in the back with it. From there, things conclude roughly the same way, with Yusuke being prevented from going to Tokyo for an event Botan promised him a ticket to so that he can spend time training with Genkai. And that wraps up part 1 of this comparison series. Like I mentioned earlier, this took a surprising amount of time to get done, but it's been fun so far and I'm having a blast reading the manga. In the next video, we'll cover the Beasts of Maze Castle and whatever form the Rescue Yukina arc takes. I want to try to split these videos into clean chunks and not end them in awkward places, but we'll see how that goes. Once again, another huge thank you to these wonderful people for their continued support over on Patreon. If you'd like to support the channel, follow the Patreon link in the description and pinned comment. Also feel free to leave a comment about what anime you'd like to see me compare to the source material. Remember to take care of yourselves and others. I hope your day's remainder becomes Eternian. I'll see you again soon, and as always, thanks for watching.